There are things the ocean teaches you that no classroom ever will. I learned that truth the first time a rogue wave hit our bow at 3 in the morning off the coast of Newfoundland. Back when I was 19 years old, a fresh-faced operations specialist seaman with exactly 47 days of sea time under my belt. The whole ship lurched sideways, and the coffee mug I'd been holding flew across the Combat Information Center and shattered against a bulkhead. I remember the sound it made, not the crash of the ceramic, the silence after. That single held breath where every soul on that bridge waited to see if the ship would roll back upright or just keep going. She came back, of course. Ships like that always do, if you treat them right. But I never forgot that silence. 28 years later, standing on the bridge of the USS Decatur, I heard it again. Only this time, the wave that nearly killed us wasn't made of water. It was made of arrogance. My name is Senior Chief Operations Specialist. At the time of this story, I had 20 years in the United States Navy, 17 of them spent on surface combatants, the last 9 aboard the Decatur, an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer, hull number DDG-73, $2.1 billion of American steel, gas turbines, and the most advanced radar suite afloat. I knew every hum that ship made. I could tell you from the vibration in my boot soles whether we were making 20 knots or 22. I could hear a bearing going bad in the SPS-67 surface search radar 2 days before the maintenance logs flagged it. Some men are married to their wives. I love my wife dearly, God rest her, but I was married to that ship in a way that only sailors understand. She spoke to me, not in words. In frequencies, vibrations, the pitch of wind across the signal halyards, and the way the bow cut through a cross swell at speed. I listened. That was my job. I listened, and I interpreted, and I kept people alive. For most of my career, the officers I served under understood a simple, unwritten law of the Navy: the chief runs the ship. Oh, sure, the commanding officer sets the course, the executive officer keeps the paperwork in order, and the division officers give the orders on paper. But down in the guts of the vessel, in the engineering spaces, and the combat information center, and the radar rooms, it's the chiefs and senior chiefs and master chiefs who make the whole machine breathe. A good officer knows this. A good officer leans on his senior, enlisted like a man leans on a cane after surgery, not ashamed, just grateful for the support. The best officers I ever served under would walk into CIC, look at me, and say, "Senior Chief, what do I need to know?" And I would tell them, and they would listen, and nobody died. Then Ensign Kyle Whitmore reported aboard. I remember the day he arrived because it was unseasonably warm for Norfolk in October, and I was on the quarterdeck supervising a store's unload when the officer of the deck told me our new combat systems division officer was crossing the brow. I turned and watched a young man, maybe 25 or 26, step onto the ship carrying a leather briefcase, not a sea bag, not a duffel, a leather briefcase, the kind you see a management consultant carry into a boardroom in Manhattan. He was wearing his service dress blues, which was appropriate enough, but they were immaculate in a way that told me they'd never been worn at sea. No salt stains on the cuffs, no fading on the shoulders from sun exposure. The creases were perfect, pressed so sharp you could cut bread with them. His shoes were mirror shined, and I mean genuinely mirror shined, not the quick buff that most of us managed. He looked like a recruiting poster. He looked like he'd been assembled in a factory. I extended my hand and introduced myself. Senior Chief Birch, Combat Systems Division, welcome aboard. He shook my hand, and his grip was firm in that deliberate, trained way that people who've read books about leadership squeeze your hand. He looked me in the eye, which I appreciated, and he said, "Senior Chief, I've been looking forward to this. I have a lot of ideas about how we can optimize this division's performance metrics." Those were his exact words. Performance metrics. I felt something cold settle into the base of my spine, the same instinct that told me when a storm was coming before the barometer moved. But I smiled and told him I looked forward to working with him, because that's what you do. You give a man a chance. Over the next 3 weeks, Ensign Whitmore made himself known. He had graduated from Officer Candidate School just 4 months prior, after spending 3 years in the civilian world working for a management consulting firm in Boston. Before that, he'd earned an MBA from a respectable university. He had never served as enlisted. He had no prior military experience of any kind. He had joined the Navy, he told me once over coffee in the wardroom, because he wanted to apply lean management principles to a legacy organization. I set my coffee cup down very carefully when he said that, because I didn't trust my hands not to shake. He began holding daily meetings. I don't mean the standard morning brief that every division does, where you run through the plan of the day and make sure everyone knows their watch station. I mean meetings. Hour-long meetings with PowerPoint slides projected on the bulkhead of CIC, with phrases like synergy optimization and cross-functional accountability matrices and waste stream identification. My sailors sat in those meetings with the glazed expressions of men watching paint dry in a language they didn't speak. One of my second classes, A young woman named Petty Officer Alvarez, who was one of the sharpest radar operators I'd ever trained, passed me a note during the third such meeting. It read simply, "Senior Chief, is this real?" I wrote back, "Stand by," because I was still giving him a chance. The problem started small. Whitmore reorganized the watch rotation based on what he called a fatigue optimization model he'd developed using a spreadsheet. It looked elegant on paper. In practice, it meant that my most experienced operators were being rotated off the radar consoles during the mid-watch, the zero dark 100 hours when shipping traffic in our operating area was heaviest and the risk of a contact slipping through was greatest, and replaced by junior sailors who were technically qualified but lacked the instinct that only years of staring at a scope can develop. I brought this to his attention privately in his stateroom with data. I showed him the contact density charts. I showed him the historical incident reports. I explained calmly and respectfully that the mid-watch was not the time to rest your veterans. It was the time to lean on them. He listened. I'll give him that. He sat behind his desk and he listened. And when I was done, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Senior Chief, I appreciate your experience, but I think we need to trust the data over institutional memory. Institutional memory is just another word for bias." I stared at him for a long moment. I thought about the 16-hour watch I'd stood in the Taiwan Strait in 2007 when we tracked a Chinese submarine for 9 hours using nothing but passive sonar contacts and the instinct of 3 sailors who could hear the difference between a diesel boat and a biologics return. Institutional memory, he called it bias. I said, "AI, sir," and I walked out and I started keeping a log. It was a green hardbound notebook, the kind you can buy at any Navy exchange. I dated every entry. I wrote down every conversation, every order, every recommendation I made, and every time it was overruled. I noted the time, the location, who was present, and what was said. I wasn't planning a mutiny. I wasn't trying to build a case. Not yet. I was just listening to that cold feeling in my spine, the one that told me the barometer was dropping. Old sailors learn to trust that feeling. The ones who don't get to be old sailors. 6 weeks after Ensign Whitmore reported aboard, we received orders to participate in a joint exercise off the coast of Virginia, after which we were to proceed directly to our home port of Norfolk for a scheduled maintenance availability. The exercise went fine, mostly because Whitmore was confined to observing from CIC, while the tactical action officer, a competent lieutenant commander, ran the combat systems. But the transit home is where everything changed. We were 2 days out of Norfolk when the weather began to turn. I watched it build on the radar for hours before the bridge team even mentioned it. A low-pressure system was sliding down from the northeast, dragging a cold front behind it like a curtain. The sea state forecast called for 8 to 12-foot swells building to 15 to 20 by the time we reached the channel approach to the Chesapeake Bay. Winds out of the north, northeast at 30, 5 knots, gusting to 50, rain, reduced visibility. The kind of weather where you slow down, you double your lookouts, and you thank God for good radar and better operators. I briefed the captain, Commander Patricia Harmon, a 22-year veteran who'd driven ships through typhoons in the Western Pacific. She nodded and said, "Senior Chief, I want your best people on the scopes when we make the approach. No substitutions." I told her she'd have them. She looked at me with that expression commanding officers get when they know something their senior chief isn't saying. "How's your new DIVO working out?" she asked. I hesitated for half a second. "He's learning, ma'am," I said. She held my gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Make sure he doesn't learn on my ship's hull." The night before we were scheduled to enter the channel, Ensign Whitmore called me to his stateroom. He had his laptop open, and on the screen was a transit plan he'd developed. He wanted to increase our approach speed from 12 knots to 18. His reasoning, which he presented with a PowerPoint slide, was that a faster approach would reduce our total transit time by 47 minutes, thereby allowing us to reach the pier ahead of schedule, which would, quote, "demonstrate proactive time management to squadron." He showed me a chart with arrows and colored zones. It looked like something from a business school case study. Clean, logical, completely divorced from reality. I took a breath. I said, "Sir, the channel approach to Norfolk in this weather at 18 knots is extremely dangerous. The current in the Thimble Shoal channel runs perpendicular to our course, and in heavy weather, the cross current combined with high speed reduces our margin for error to almost nothing. At 12 knots, we have time to correct. At 18, we don't." He frowned. "Senior Chief, the Arleigh Burke class is rated for speeds well above 18 knots. On open water, sir. Not in a restricted channel with a beam current and 20-foot swells. Are you saying the ship can't handle it?" "I'm saying the physics don't care about our schedule, sir." He closed his laptop. He looked at me with an expression I'd seen before on the faces of men who believed that confidence was the same thing as competence. "Senior Chief Birch, I've reviewed the ship's performance data. The hull can take it. The engines can take it. I think the issue here might be a comfort level problem, and I respect that. but I'm the division officer, and I've made my recommendation to the XO. I felt ice water slide down my back. You've already briefed the XO. I sent him an email this afternoon with my analysis. He said he'd review it. I went directly to the executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Brian Hale. He was in his stateroom eating a sandwich and reading message traffic. I told him about Whitmore's plan. Hale chewed slowly and said, he sent me something. I haven't read it yet. I said, XO, with respect, you need to read it and kill it before it gets to the captain. 18 knots in the Thimble Shoal Channel in this sea state is asking for a casualty. Hale looked at me with tired eyes. You think he'd actually push this with the soul? I said, sir, he thinks his spreadsheet is smarter than the ocean. Yes, I think he'll push it. Hale sighed and said he'd handle it. He didn't handle it. Or rather, he handled it in the way that overworked saws sometimes do. He forwarded Whitmore's email to the captain with a note that said, Ensign, Whitmore's transit recommendation for your review. No commentary, no recommendation to disapprove, just a pass through. I found this out later, and it still makes my blood pressure rise. Commander Harmon, to her credit, rejected the 18-knot approach. She set the speed at 12 knots and told the navigator to build the plan accordingly. But she didn't counsel Whitmore. She didn't shut him down. She was busy. She was managing 100 other problems, and she assumed that one note would be sufficient for a junior officer who should have known his place. She was wrong. The morning of our approach, the weather was exactly as bad as the forecast had promised, and then some. I stood on the bridge wing at 0500 and looked out at a sea that was the color of wet concrete, heaving in long, violent swells that broke white at the crests. The wind was a living thing, howling through the superstructure with a sound like an animal in pain. Rain came sideways, not falling but driven, stinging any exposed skin like needles. The ship rolled 15 degrees to port, hung there for a heartbeat, then groaned back to starboard. Below my feet, I could feel the gas turbines humming at reduced power as the helmsman fought to keep us on course. The barometer had dropped to 29.2 and was still falling. It was a bad morning to be at sea. It was a worse morning to be entering a channel I had my best people on watch. Alvarez was on the SPS-67 surface search radar. Petty Officer First Class DeMarco was on the SPS-73, tracking navigation contacts and channel markers. I was standing behind them in CIC, wearing my sound-powered phone headset connected to the bridge. The captain was on the bridge. The navigator, Lieutenant Park, was on the bridge. The helmsman, Quartermaster Second Class Rivera, was on the wheel, and I trusted Rivera more than I trusted most of the officers on that ship. He had hands that could feel the rudder like an extension of his own body. We were ready. We were as ready as 28 years of experience could make us. Then Ensign Whitmore walked into CIC. He was wearing his fall weather jacket, which was still dry, meaning he hadn't been topside. He had a clipboard. He positioned himself at the tactical display and began reviewing the navigation track. I watched him from across the compartment, the way you watch a wasp that's gotten into your car. Carefully. Without sudden movements, he studied the display for several minutes, then turned to me and said, in a voice loud enough for the entire CIC Watch team to hear, Senior Chief, I noticed we're making 12 knots. I believe we discussed a faster approach speed. I kept my voice level. The captain set the speed at 12 knots. Sir, I'm aware of what the captain ordered. I'm asking whether, in your professional opinion, we couldn't safely make 16. We could not. 14. Oh, sir, 12 knots is the appropriate speed for this channel in the sea state. I briefed the captain. She concurs. He stared at me. I stared back. The ship rolled, and the overhead lights flickered. Somewhere below us, something heavy slid across the deck and clanged against the bulkhead. Then he did something I had never seen a junior officer do in 28 years. He picked up the 21MC, the ship's intercom, and called the bridge. Bridge, CIC, this is Ensign Whitmore. I'd like to recommend we increase speed to 14 knots to expedite the channel transit. I believe conditions are within acceptable parameters. There was a pause. Then the captain's voice came through the speaker flat and hard. Negative, maintain 12 knots. CIC, who authorized this communication? I keyed my headset. Captain, Senior Chief Birch. I did not authorize it. Ensign Whitmore acted independent. Another pause. As a Whitmore, you are relieved of watch duties in CIC. Report to the bridge. Whitmore's face went red. Not embarrassed, red, angry red. He set the 21MC handset down, squared his shoulders, and walked out of CIC without looking at me. The hatch clanged shut behind him. Alvarez glanced at me over her shoulder. I shook my head once. Focus on the scope. She turned back. For 20 minutes, everything was quiet. We entered the Thimble Shoal Channel at 12 knots, the ship riding the swells with the heavy, deliberate motion of a vessel in restricted waters. The channel markers appeared on radar as bright, consistent returns, and DeMarco called each one to the bridge with the practiced rhythm of a man who'd done it 100 times. Channel marker 14, bearing 093, range 1.2 miles. The brillsman corrected. The ship crept forward through the heaving gray water. Then the call came from the bridge that changed everything. It was the XO's voice. Sea ice bridge. The captain has left the bridge to address a casualty in engineering. Ensign Whitmore has the con. I felt the deck drop out from under me, and it had nothing to do with the sea state. The XO was the senior officer on the bridge, but he had delegated con to Whitmore. In theory, this was within regulations. Whitmore was a qualified officer of the deck, having completed his board just 2 weeks prior. In practice, it was like handing the keys to a freight train to a teenager who just gotten his learner's permit in a snowstorm. On a mountain pass, I keyed my headset. Bridge CSC Senior Chief Birch. Confirm and sign Whitmore has the con. Confirm, request the XO maintain supervisory presence on the bridge. There was a pause. Then the XO's voice, irritated. Senior Chief, I'm standing right here. Focus on your scope. I bit down on what I wanted to say. I picked up my green notebook. I wrote the time 0547. I wrote, Ensign Whitmore has the con. Captain off bridge. XO present but has delegated authority. Sea state rough. Visibility quarter mile. Channel transit in progress. For 8 minutes, nothing happened. Whitmore, to my grudging surprise, maintained course and speed. The ship tracked down the center of the channel. DeMarco called the markers. The helmsman steered. I began to think, cautiously, that maybe the earlier confrontation had knocked some sense into him. Maybe the captain's rebuke had landed. Then Whitmore's voice came over the 12MC, and it had a quality to it that I recognized immediately. It was the voice of a man trying to prove something. Cease. Bridge. I'm adjusting speed to 15 knots. My hand was on the transmit key before he finished the sentence. Bridge, CIC, Senior Chief Birch. I strongly advise against any speed increase in the channel. Current sea state and cross current creates significant risk at speeds above 12 knots. Recommend maintaining current speed. Whitmore's response was immediate. Senior Chief, I've assessed the conditions and I'm comfortable with 15 knots. The ship is handling well. Sir, the cross current at marker 18 is measured at 2.5 knots. At 15 knots, our lateral drift rate will exceed our rudder's ability to correct in time if we encounter a wind gust. I am formally advising against this order. Noted. Increasing to 15 knots. I looked at Alvarez. She was staring at me. Her face was pale. I keyed my headset one more time. Bridge CIC. Senior Chief Birch, I am logging a formal objection to the speed increase. Time 0555. I request the XO review and override. The XO's voice came back, strained, uncomfortable. Senior Chief, your objection is noted. Ensign Whitmore has the con. I wrote it all down, every word. The time, the speed, the sea state, the names. Then I closed the notebook. I set it on the console beside me. And I said to my team, quietly, so only they could hear, do your jobs, track everything, report everything, and hold on to something. The ship surged forward as the gas turbines spooled up. I felt the acceleration in my legs, a subtle shift in the deck's vibration from a steady thrum to a higher pitched hum. On the radar, the channel markers began passing more quickly. DeMarco's voice pipped speed to match. Marker 16 bearing 088, range 0.8 miles. Marker 17 bearing 091, range 1.3 miles. The ship began to move through the water with a different character, no longer plodding and deliberate but urgent, aggressive, like a horse fighting its rider. I could feel the cross current pushing against the hull, a lateral pressure that translated into a constant, subtle drift to port. At 12 knots, the helmsman could correct that drift with minor rudder adjustments. At 15 knots, those adjustments had to be larger, faster, and more frequent. I smelled ozone, that sharp electric smell that comes from electronics working hard, from radar transmitters at full power, from the hum of a ship's combat system straining against the environment. Under it was the salt smell of the sea coming through the ventilation system and the metallic tang of old coffee and warm circuitry that every CIC and every warship in the world smells like. These were the smells of my life. They were the smells of home. And at that moment, they were the smells of a disaster building, CIC bridge, coming to course 275 to follow the channel. I checked the chart overlay on the repeater. Course 275 was correct for the next leg. But the turn at 15 knots in this sea state with this cross current would swing the stern wide. The turning radius at 15 knots was significantly larger than at 12. The channel at that point was 600 yards wide. We needed every yard of it. Helm is answering, coming to 275. Rivera's voice reported over the circuit. I could hear the strain in it. Rivera knew. Good helmsmen always know. The ship began to turn, and I felt the deck tilt as the rudder bit into the water, and the hull leaned into the curve. On the radar, I watched our track begin to arc. DeMarco called it. Track is drifting left of center channel. Recommend 5 degrees right to correct. The bridge acknowledged, but the correction was slow. At 15 knots, the ship's momentum carried it wide. The cross current caught the whole broadside during the turn, pushing us further to port. I watched the port side channel boundary on the radar creep closer. Bridge CIC. We are approaching the port side channel boundary. Recommend immediate course correction and speed reduction. Whitmore's voice came back. Tight now. The confidence fraying at the edges like a rope under too much load. Correcting. Helm, right 10 degrees rudder. Rivera's voice strained. Right 10 degrees rudder, aye. Sir, recommend right 20 and reduce speed. Right 10 is sufficient. It wasn't sufficient. The next 47 seconds are burned into my memory with the clarity of a high-definition photograph. I have replayed them in my mind 1,000 times, awake and asleep, and they never change. At 0550, 9 and 13 seconds, a gust of wind hit the ship's superstructure from the port beam. The anemometer on the bridge later recorded at 53 knots. The gust caught the ship mid-turn at 15 knots with 10 degrees of right rudder and a 2.5 knot cross current already pushing us to port. The combined forces exceeded the rudder's corrective authority. The ship slew to port. Not gradually, not gently. The bow swung to port like a gate being kicked open. I grabbed the edge of the radar console with both hands as the deck tilted. Behind me, a chair broke free of its tie, down and crashed into the far bulkhead. Alvarez braced herself against her console. DeMarco's coffee mug exploded on the deck. On the radar, I watched our ship's heading indicator swing through 270-265260, sliding past the channel boundary and toward the shoal water on the port side. The fathometer readout in CIC, which I could see on the overhead display, began dropping. 60 feet. 55. 50. 45. An Arleigh Burke draws 31 feet of water. We had 14 feet of clearance under the keel, and it was shrinking. I keyed the 21MC. I did not shout. I spoke with the cold, level precision of a man who has trained for catastrophe for 3 decades. Bridge CI ship is standing into danger. Recommend all stop an emergency right full rudder. Depth under keel is decreasing rapidly. For 2 seconds, there was no response. 2 seconds of silence that felt like 2 centuries. I could hear the wind screaming through the superstructure. I could feel the ship shuddering as the hull encountered the shallower water, the ride becoming rougher, choppier, the waves rebounding off the bottom and creating a confused, violent chop that hammered the hull from every direction. Then the XO's voice, not Whitmore's. The XO, all stop! Emergency! Right full rudder! Helmsman, right full rudder now. Rivera's voice immediate and ferocious. Right full rudder, aye! Engines all stop, aye! The gas turbine's pitch dropped. The ship shuddered as the propellers bit water in reverse. The rudder swung hard to starboard, 35 degrees the maximum, and the hull began slowly, agonizingly slowly, to answer. On the radar, the heading indicator crept to the right. 262, 263, 65. The fathometer hit 37 feet, 6 feet under the keel, 6 feet between the bottom of a 9,000-ton warship and the sandy bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, 6 feet between an uneventful transit and a grounding that would have ended careers, cost hundreds of millions of dollars, and possibly injured or killed sailors. 6 feet. The length of a tall man lying down. That was our margin. That was what Ensign Kyle Whitmore's performance optimization had purchased us. The ship clawed back into the channel. Rivera, God bless him, fought the helm with everything he had, using the rudder and the remaining momentum to drag the bow back to starboard. The cross current helped now, ironically, pushing us back toward the center of the channel as the ship's heading corrected. Within 90 seconds, we were back on track, making 5 knots, the engines at a head slow, the ship wallowing in the swells like a stunned animal. In CIC, nobody spoke. The only sound was the hum of the electronics, the ping of the radar, and the distant howl of the wind. Alvarez had tears on her face, not from fear. And I picked up my notebook. I wrote the depth. I wrote XO assumed con from Ensign Whitmore at 0559. Ship corrected from imminent grounding. No contact with bottom. No casualties. 6 feet. And I underlined it twice. On the bridge, I learned later Ensign Whitmore had frozen. When the gust hit and the ship slewed, he had stood at the Pelorus with his mouth open and his hands at his sides, paralyzed. He had given no orders. He had said nothing. The XO had physically pushed past him to reach the helm console and take the con. Rivera told me afterward that Whitmore's face was the color of old paper, white, with sweat running down his temples despite the cold. He stood there, motionless, for the entire 90 seconds it took to correct the ship's course. He did not speak again for the remainder of the transit. The captain returned to the bridge 11 minutes later, having resolved the engineering casualty, which turned out to be a minor lube oil alarm on the number 2 generator. She took one look at the navigation track replay on the bridge display, one look at Whitmore standing in the corner of the bridge like a scolded child, and one look at the XO who couldn't meet her eyes. She said 4 words. Senior Chief, my cabin. I went. I handed her the notebook. She read it from beginning to end, every entry, starting from the day Whitmore had reported aboard. It took her 40 minutes. She didn't interrupt me. She didn't ask questions. When she was done, she closed the notebook, placed it on her desk, put both hands flat on the surface, and said, "Why didn't you bring this to me sooner?" I said, "Ma'am, I brought individual concerns through the chain of command on 6 separate occasions. Each time Ensign Whitmore overruled my recommendations. I briefed the XO twice. The XO did not intervene. I didn't come to you directly because I was trying to respect the chain of command. She looked at me for a long time. And if that ship had grounded, Senior Chief, then I would have been standing in CIC with a clear conscience, a detailed log, and the knowledge that I did everything within my authority to prevent it. She nodded slowly. Get some sleep. You've earned it. Oh, the investigation that followed was swift, thorough, and merciless. The Navy does not take kindly to officers who nearly put warships on the bottom. Commander Harmon reported the incident to the destroyer squadron commander within hours of our mooring. Within 24 hours, a formal investigation was ordered under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. My green notebook became Exhibit 1. The radar recordings, the fathometer logs, the bridge audio recordings, the 21C communications, all of it was preserved and reviewed. The facts were unambiguous. Ensign Whitmore had increased speed in a restricted channel against the explicit recommendations of the senior enlisted expert, without the captain's authorization, and had frozen when the resulting emergency developed. The XO had failed to adequately supervise a junior officer who had already demonstrated poor judgment. Whitmore was detached from the Decatur within the week. He was reassigned to a shore billet, a desk in a logistics office in San Diego, where the closest he would come to a ship was watching them through a window. His record was annotated with a formal counseling, a letter of reprimand, and a note that he was not to be assigned to a seagoing billet without additional training and evaluation. His career in any meaningful sense was over. He would serve out his obligation and leave the Navy, and somewhere, eventually he would tell people at cocktail parties that he'd served on a destroyer, and he would leave out the part where he nearly sank it. The XO received a non-punitive letter of caution, a gentler administrative action, but one that would haunt his promotion prospects for years. He knew it, he accepted it. To his credit, he sought me out the day before he transferred off the ship 3 months later, and he said, Senior Chief, I should have listened to you. I told him yes, he should have. We shook hands. I never saw him again. As for me, I received a Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal for my actions during the transit. The citation praised my exceptional professional judgment, unwavering adherence to safety standards, and meticulous documentation that preserved a detailed record of events. The captain pinned it on me at quarters on a Tuesday morning with the entire crew watching. She said, in front of everyone, this is what right looks like. I won't pretend I didn't feel a swell of pride. I did. But the medal sits in a drawer now, next to my other ribbons and my retired ID card. I don't take it out. I don't need to. The real reward was simpler than that. 273 sailors went home to their families that night. That's the only metric that ever mattered. I retired from the Navy 7 months later, at 28 years and 9 months of service. I had been eligible to stay for 30, and the Command Master Chief tried to talk me into it, but I was tired, not physically. I could still stand a 16-hour watch and feel fine in the morning. I was tired in my soul. Tired of watching people who had never stood a watch, never felt a ship try to kill them, never smelled ozone and salt and fear at 3 in the morning, walk onto a bridge and tell the people who had done all of those things that their experience was bias. Tired of fighting a system that promoted credentials over competence and spreadsheets over seamanship. Tired of being right and having to prove it with a near catastrophe before anyone listened. I live in a small house near the water now. I can see the mouth of the Chesapeake from my back porch if I stand on a chair. Some mornings when the wind is right and the tide is running, I can hear the foghorns from the channel. And sometimes when a destroyer transits past, her hull cutting a white line through the gray-green water. I feel the deck moving under my feet again. I feel the vibration of the turbines. I smell the ozone and the salt, and I remember. Here's what I want to leave you with, if you're still listening. There is a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is reading a book about the ocean. Wisdom is standing on a bridge at 3 in the morning with 40-foot seas and a failing radar and knowing in your bones what to do next. Knowledge can be taught in a classroom. Wisdom can only be earned in the dark, in the cold, in the moments when the ship is trying to die, and you are the only thing standing between her and the bottom. You cannot optimize wisdom. You cannot streamline it. You cannot put it in a PowerPoint and project it on a bulkhead. It lives in the hands of the helmsman, the eyes of the radar operator, and the gut of the chief who has watched the sea long enough to know when she's about to turn mean. Every year, in every industry, in every organization, some bright young person with a degree and a laptop walks into a place where people have been doing hard, dangerous, skilled work for decades, and that young person says, I can do this better. I can do this faster. I can do this cheaper. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes fresh eyes see what tired eyes miss. I'm not so old and bitter that I can't admit that. But sometimes More often than the management textbooks will ever acknowledge that young person is wrong. And when they're wrong in an office, you lose money. When they're wrong on a ship, you lose lives. Respect the craft. Respect the people who have given their lives to it. Ask questions before you give orders. Listen before you speak. And for the love of God, if a senior chief with 28 years of sea time tells you the ocean doesn't care about your schedule, believe him. He's not saying it because he's resistant to change. He's not saying it because he's protecting his ego. He's saying it because he's buried friends who didn't listen. He's saying it because he has 6 feet of water seared into his memory as the margin between a war story and a memorial service. The sea doesn't negotiate. The sea doesn't read spreadsheets. The sea doesn't care about your MBA. The sea takes what it wants when it wants, and the only thing that has ever stood between it and the people on those ships is the knowledge, the skill, and the hard-won wisdom of the men and women who have learned to read its moods. That wisdom is not bias. It is not institutional memory. It is the most valuable thing the Navy possesses, and it cannot be replaced by an algorithm, a consultant, or an ensign with a briefcase. My name is Tom Birch, Senior Chief, United States Navy, retired, and that is the last course I will ever set.